in memory of their parents, Tzvi Hirsch ben Yosef HaKohen, Yentel Mindel bas David HaLevi, Bunim Tzvi ben Chaim, and Devorah bas Yisrael Yol. Our learning should be in Aliyah for their neshamas. Also, the Talmud Torah this week is sponsored by the Weisbord family as a refuah shlema for Aviva bas Shena Chana. Aviva bas Shena Chana should have a speedy recovery in the merit of all of the lives and souls she's touched throughout the years. Okay, so today's daf is daf Samach Zayin, and we're going to be picking up. Three lines down on Amud Aleph, but it's worthwhile probably to just review very quickly what we went over yesterday, because today's Gemara will reference back to it in multiple instances. So we had this story with Reb Chanina bar Yosef, Reb Chia bar Abba, and Reb Asi, who went to the certain inn, and the inn owner showed up on Shabbos, and they allowed, basically they had a discussion back and forth, and ultimately Reb Yochanan approved of their thought that they could rent the Nachri's space, so to speak, on Shabbos, and then they could, in turn, although they couldn't make an Eruv, they could all be Mavato Rishus to one person, and at least one person is able to carry in and out. So you see, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that you can both rent from a Nachri and be Mavato Rishus on Shabbos itself. And then we brought the three statements of Shmuel, of which the third contradicted that and said that the way we understood Shmuel's statements were that if you have a case where they asar on each other but you can't make an Eruv, in that case you can't be Mavatal. So this is such an example where you have Jews living in this inn, they can't carry without an Eruv, and yet they weren't eligible to do an Eruv because there was a guy there, and we figured out that case is talking about where the guy came on Shabbos. So we see that Shmuel argues on Rabbi Yochanan. So that was one aspect. And then the other aspect that we discussed had to do with Shmuel essentially set forth three cases, but the underlying premise was that Shmuel was saying in order to do bittul, in order to be mevatel something, you have to, and this is the way that Abaye understood him, you have to have two elements present, which is that they have to asar on each other, meaning they have to restrict each other's ability to carry, and they have to be relevant to being able to make an Eruv. And the way Abaye understood that, where we're talking about the cases that the case that's permitted to do bittul is when you have one chutzner behind another, because then they can make an Eruv together, and if they don't make an Eruv, they asar on one another. Whereas if they would be side by side chatzeros, then you would not be able to make the bittul, because while it's true that they're relevant to making an Eruv together, they don't have to make an Eruv together. They don't asar, so that violates Shmuel's rule. And that's how both Abaye and Rav Yosef understood Shmuel's rule. Rava, in turn, understood it differently by saying that you cannot you cannot be mevatel rishus from chatzar to chatzar. So therefore, even if it's an inner and an outer chatzar, you're not going to be able to do that bittul. And the one exception to that is, as we outlined yesterday, according to Shmuel, was if the inner and outer chatzar both put their Eruv in the inner chatzar, and then one of the outer chatzar people neglected to join the Eruv. In that instance, you could have him. You could basically, what you could then do is you could say that the inner people could say to the outer chatzar, the reason we joined with you in an Eruv, to make this all one big happy family, as we called it yesterday, the reason we joined with you as an Eruv was to enhance our ability to carry. But now by being connected to you, you've caused us a problem, because one of your people didn't make an Eruv, and therefore he's answering on all of us. So in that instance, the way Rava understands Shmuel would agree that the inner people could say to the outer people, do bittul and be mevatel your rishus, be mevatel your partnership in our Eruv to us, so that we'll still be able to carry. And therefore, because the Eruv itself is physically situated in the inside, and because the inside chutzner has now separated from the outside chutzner through the mechanism of bittul, therefore that's the one instance where, in Rava's understanding of Shmuel, that you would be able to do bittul. We also brought the psak of Rabbi Yochanan, where Rabbi Yochanan said that in fact you can do bittul between reshus to reshus, and Rabbi Yochanan, unlike both Rava and Abaya, who were interpreting Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan would say, I disagree. You can in fact do bittul even if Shmuel's rules aren't present, and we'll analyze that a little bit today. But therefore, he said you could do bittul from reshus to reshus. Okay, so that's a little bit of review of yesterday, and now we'll start today's daf. 3 lines down on Samach Zayin Amud Aleph. Says the Gemara, Amrle Rav Huna Breid Rav Yeshua. Rav Huna, the son of Rabbi Yeshua, said, L'Rava to Rava, V'chishachach echad min apnimis v'lo iriv. So again, we said there were 4 cases. You could have, this is a case where you had an inner and outer chutzner. They each had an eruv for their own chutzner. They combined those eruvin by putting them in the same place. And so you have 4 possibilities, of which we said 3 don't work according to the way Rava understands Shmuel, doesn't work for bittul. So you have the possibility that both eruvs are in the outer chutzner, and then you could have theoretically one of the people in the outer chutzner forgot to join, or one of the people in the inner chutzner. In both those cases, we said it's aser. We also said that even if both eruvs are inside, and it's someone from the inside who forgot, then even in that case, you cannot do bittul. And the only case you could do bittul is if you had 2 people, if you have both eruvs on the inside and the person who forgot was on the outside. So now Rav Huna Breid Rav Yeshua asked Rava. He says, wait a second. When the case that you said doesn't work, where one of the inner people forgot, so both eruvs are in the inner chutzner, and one of the inner people forgot and didn't make an eruv. Why should both of them be aser? Why not say as follows? Libato, and in fact you could say this on at least one or more of the other cases. Why not say libato bar pnimis libnei pnimis? Why not let the inner? So here what you have. You have the eruvs are in the inner chutzner, and the guy who forgot to join is in the inner chutzner. Why not have him be mevatel his reshus to his fellow inner chutzner mates? Because again, it can't be the outer ones, because Rava holds in Shmuel that you cannot do bittul from chutzner to chutzner. But why not have the inner guy relinquish his rights to the other inner fellows? And it's kind of a 2-step process. Once you do that, then you're going to say, well, they're all also one big happy family because you merged the eruvim. And now you've essentially removed this guy who forgot from the inner eruv by being mevatel his reshus to the other people inside. And then say the inside and the outside people, those people they had combined their eruvs. So we've excluded the guy who was the problem. So why is it that you can't do that? Again, granted that he cannot be mevatel his ownership to the people on the outside chutzner or to the conglomerate of everyone in the 2 chutzneros, but why can't he be mevatel his reshus to the other people in his chutzner? And then, as a second step, because there was an error between the 2 chutzneros, everyone should be able to carry. So that's what he's saying. Why are both aser? Libatel bar pnimis l'bnei pnimis. That v'teisi chitzona v'tishtri b'hadayu. So why not let the guy inside be mevatel to his fellow chutzner mates, and then you bring in the outside people because they did an eruv with the inside people, and say, look, everyone can carry. So to this, Rava answered Rav Huna Breid Rav Yeshua. He said, "Keman." So he says, who are you asking your question like? The way you're asking your question makes sense. According to Rabbi Eliezer, this is actually something that we encountered earlier on Daf Chavav, I think, which is the idea. There is a machlokus between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbanan about when you're mevatel reshus. Do you have to be mevatel reshus to everyone in the chutzner, or could you, let's say, for example, be mevatel reshus to one person? So according to Rabbi Eliezer, he's saying you don't need to be mevatel to every person. So if you hold like Rabbi Eliezer, that you don't need to be mevatel reshus to every person, so then your mechanism works, because essentially you're being mevatel your reshus only to the people in your inner chutzner, which is half of the broader chutzner. So that Rabbi Eliezer would allow. But answers Rava, Kika Amina l'Rabbanan d'Amri tzarich levatel l'kol echad v'echad. When I said my halacha that said that the fellow on the inside who forgot, the reason he can't be mevatel his rishus just to his fellow chutzner mates, and then in turn the Eruv should cover everyone, is because he's of the opinion that if someone is going to be mevatel the rishus on Shabbos, they have to be mevatel the rishus to everyone who's part of the chutzner. You can't just do it to one person. And if you have to do it to everyone, so then according to Rava, that's a problem, because Rava's understanding of Shmuel is a mevatlin michatzer lechatzer, that you can't do bittul from one chutzner to another. And so the suggestion here was let him do bittul only to some of the people, and then everyone would join in thereafter. The idea is the Rabbanan would say you can't do that, because at the time he does bittul, he needs to do bittul to everyone within his Eruv, and everyone within his Eruv includes the people in the outer chutzner. And according to Rava's understanding of Shmuel, you cannot do bittul from one chutzner to another. Okay, we're at the 2 dots on Samach Zayin Amud Aleph. Rav Chisda, Rav Sheshes, Kipagi Bahadadi, that when Rav Chisda and Rav Sheshes would meet each other, Rav Chisda Martin Sifsa say mimasnaisa Rav Sheshes. The Rav Chisda's lips would shake from the masnaisa Rav Sheshes. So Rashi explains that Shaya Mishnayis Seduros Lo, that Rav Sheshes had all of the Brisas and the Mishnahs like very organized in his head. The Yari Rav Chisda, and Rav Chisda was worried Shelo Yikshaloi min Mishnah Mishnah v'Yamilo L'Tartzon, because Rav Sheshes knew all these Mishnayos, so he was going to tell him why this one conflicts with that one conflicts with the other. So Rav Chisda used to be a little bit afraid of what Rav Sheshes might ask him. Rav Sheshes Marta Kule Gufe mi Pulpule Rav Chisda. And Rav Sheshes, on the other hand, who had this broad encyclopedic knowledge, but he used to be scared of the pilpul of Rav Chisda, because Rav Chisda, as Rashi explains, charif v'saver, he was very sharp and thought through, v'amak b'sheilaso, and he would ask very he would have very deep questions that he would ask. Okay, we also know the Gemara in Brachas talks about the fact that we talk about whether 2 Talmidei Chachamim who are engaging in halacha should count as mezuman, and in that case, it was Rav Sheshes and Rav Chisda who pointed to each other and said, like the two of us. So they were a pair that used to learn together, but they had this fear, so to speak, of each other. But in any event, that's just an intro for a couple of questions that Rav Chisda is going to ask Rav Sheshes. So says the Gemara, Rav Chisda asked Rav Sheshes as follows: Shnei batim mishnei tzidei rishus harabim. So you have a rishus harabim going through town, and you have 2 houses on either side. We've actually dealt with this scenario a number of times in the halacha Rabbi Yehuda, but we're going to talk about where you put up 2 lechis, but we're going to talk about something different here. So what happened? You had the rishus harabim going through, you had 2 houses on either side. Ubo nachrim ve'kifum mechitza b'Shabbos. So Nachrim came along, Goyim. So these, and as Rashi points out, we know that even if a Jew puts up a mechitza on Shabbos, whether he's supposed to or not, ultimately it's a mechitza, surely a guy. So what happened is they put up 2 walls in the Rishus Harabim. So now you have these 2 houses that used to open to Rishus Harabim, but now they open to this enclosed area between them, because you put up a wall. In other words, if these are your 2 houses, you put up a wall here and here, and you now have a fully enclosed area that used to be the Rishus Harabim. And you have 2 houses that open on it, Reuven and Shimon, they both open onto the house. So the issue now is that this is now a Rishus HaYachid. It's an enclosed area, but it didn't exist when Shabbos started, because these Nachrim put it up. They put up these walls in the middle of Shabbos. So Mahu, what's the halacha about whether they could be Mevatel Rishus? Maybe Reuven could say to Shimon, I'm Mevatel my Rishus to you, and therefore Shimon's going to be able to carry out into this newfound, it's not a chatzir, but it's like a chatzir. So it says the Gemara, Aliba demand Amar aim bitur rishus mechatzir lechatzir lo tibailach. According to the one who says, which is going to be Shmuel, who says, and now we're talking even, this is Shmuel, whether according to Rava or according to Abaya, because we're talking about the case where you had 2 chatzeros who were side by side, each open to Rishus Harabim. We said that whether according to Abaya or Rava, that case is never going to allow bittul. Why? Because while it's true that they could have made an eruv between each other when you have side-by-side chatzeros, they, at the end of the day, they didn't aser on each other. They didn't restrict each other because they don't have to make an eruv between them. So according to Shmuel, in that case, you cannot do bittul from rishus to rishus. So the Gemara is saying, okay, according to the one who says that you can't do bittul from rishus to rishus when they're even side by side, hashta di bole Eruvin me esmo matzu ma'arvi amrit ein bittul rishus mechatzer lechatzer. So in that scenario, where even though they could have done an Eruv, so again, remember, Shmuel had two rules. They have to have been able to do an Eruv and they have to ask on each other. So it's in that case, where if they wanted to do an Eruv yesterday, they could have done an Eruv. The Bole Eruvin Me'esmo Matzu Ma'arvi, that if the two side-by-side chatzers had wanted yesterday before Shabbos to make an Eruv, they could have. Amrit Ein Bitul Rishus Mechatzer Chatzer. Nonetheless, you said that even though they could have done an Eruv, because they didn't ask on each other, you cannot make a Bitul between those two chatzeros. So Hacha, in this case, so then, but in this case, not only are you missing the fact that they don't aser on each other, at least when Shabbos started, because Reuven and Shimon don't aser on each other for this newfound area that the Goyim made, because at the beginning of Shabbos, it didn't exist. And not only that, they couldn't have been ma'ariv together, because again, it didn't exist, so therefore there was nothing to be ma'ariv. So the Gemara is saying, according to Shmuel, who says that even side-by-side chatzeros who could have done an Eruv yesterday, if they cannot be mavato rishus from one to the other, then surely this scenario where they yesterday neither asered on each other nor could have even done an Eruv, surely there's no question that we're not going to allow bittul from Ruvain to Shimon or Shimon to Ruvain to enable them to carry in this newfound area. Kiti bailach, however, says, this is Rav Chisda asking Rosh Hashanah, when is it a question? Al liba demand amar, according to the one who says yesh betul rishus mechatzer l'chatzer, which again, as I said in our summary review, this is the view of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was of the view that you could do bittul between rishus to rishus. You don't need necessarily the same two rules that Shmuel had, which is that they need to restrict one another and they need to also be relevant of making a chatzer. So according to them. Okay, so according to one who says yesh betul rishus mechatzer l'chatzer hasam, so maybe over there, when did we know that Rabbi Yochanan said you could do bittul between chatzer to chatzer? Was in the case where you had side-by-side chatzeros, where they did not answer on each other, but at least they were relevant to an Eruv. So you say the ibole ruve, maybe hasam the ibole ruve me esmol mati ma'arvi. So maybe since they could have done an Eruv yesterday, because they're side-by-side chatzeros, if they wanted to, they could have done an Eruv together. So therefore, batule nami mati mavato. So therefore, maybe in that case, Rabbi Yochanan said that they can do bittul rishus from one to the other, because at the beginning of Shabbos they were relevant, they could have made an Eruv together, so therefore we're going to allow them to do bittul from one to another to enable someone to carry. Aval hacha, but maybe in this case where the Nachrim put up the mechitza, delo matzi ma'arvi me'asmol, that they could not even, not only did they not aser on each other, because it didn't exist, but they couldn't have even made an Eruv at the beginning of Shabbos if they wanted, because the area didn't exist. Maybe in that case, betului nami lo matzi mavato, that even Rabbi Yochanan might say that, look, I was willing if you had one of Shmuel's two requirements met, which is that they could have made an Eruv. Maybe he would say, in that case, I was willing to let you do bittul. But where you had neither of his requirements, there was no relevance to Eruv, and they didn't answer on each other, in that case, maybe Rabbi Yochanan would say, sorry, I'm not going to let you do bittul if you're missing both of Shmuel's criteria. Or maybe, look, maybe Rabbi Yochanan has a very permissive view of bittul, which is it doesn't matter whether they could have done an Eruv together, it doesn't matter whether you ask on each other. If at the end of the day, at this point on Shabbos, it's now developed that you want to be able to carry, you don't have an Eruv, so we allow you to do bittul to one to the other. So that's the question. Shmuel had two requirements in order to do bittul. You need to be relevant in Eruv and you need to ask on each other. Rabbi Yochanan said, no, you don't need both. It's sufficient if they could have made an Eruv. At a minimum, he says that, but maybe he even goes further and would say that you don't require anything. Maybe he requires neither of Shmuel's rules. So Amr Lei, Reb Sheshes said back to Rav Chisda, Ein mevatlin. Nice try. Rabbi Yochanan, while it's true that he's more permissive than Shmuel, and he would allow bittul in a case of the side-by-side chatzeros that could have done an Eruv yesterday, he would not allow bittul in this case because they neither asked on each other at the beginning of Shabbos, nor could they have done an Eruv. Okay, next question that he asked him. Meis nachri b'Shabbos mahu. So we're going to explain this Gemara according to Rashi. So the question here is as follows. You had two Jews who were living in a chutzner together with a guy. So we know, with a nachri. So we know that in that case, they cannot do an Eruv together because we have the takana of Chazal. They didn't want them living together, so therefore, we don't allow them to make an Eruv unless he were to rent from the guy. But they didn't rent from the guy. So here's the case. You had these two Jews and the Nachri living together, and they don't have an Eruv. They're not able to carry. Now all of a sudden, the Nachri dies on Shabbos. So now the question is, he's no longer there to aser on them, to aser on each other. So the question is, at this point, now obviously they didn't have an Eruv because they didn't make an Eruv yesterday. So the question is, at this point they cannot make an Eruv, but they can they be mevatel reshus one to the other and therefore enable one of them to carry? So the Gemara says as follows: Aliba demand amar sochrin lo tiboilach. So we're going to say, according to Reb Yochanan, this is not a problem. And again, this is why I referenced back in our review the case of Reb Yochanan. So we had yesterday where Reb Chanina bar Yosef, Reb Chia bar Abba, and Reb Yossi and Reb Asi were in that inn. And what happened? We said that the innkeeper, who was a Nachri, showed up on Shabbos and now messed up if they had an Eruv or they didn't have an Eruv. We talked about this yesterday. So, but in any event, the question was, there we said that even though the Nachri showed up on Shabbos, not only, you could first of all you could rent his piece, which now makes you relevant to being able to carry, and then the one Jew could be mevatel reshus to the other. So and Rabbi Yochanan said that was a good psak that they decided over there in the inn. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, Aliba the mandamar socher, and according to the mandamar, which is Rabbi Yochanan, who said not only can they do bittul, but they can actually they can rent out the guy's interest in the innkeeper's interest in the inn on Shabbos. So lo tiboilach, because hashda in the case of the inn that we dealt with yesterday, tarti avdinon chadamibai. Because if in the case of the inn, we not only let them do bittul, but we also let them do renting from the guy. So they did renting and bittul, then of course, if you're just dealing with the question of doing bittul and you don't need to deal with rental, you're going to be able to do it. Because in this case, where the Nachri died on Shabbos, there's no longer any issue of needing to rent his interest because he no longer lives in the chutzner because he's dead. So therefore, the only question you have is one of bittul. So if, like Rabbi Yochanan, who allowed both schirus and bittul, then of course he's going to allow bittul alone. Elakiti bailach, but says Rav Chisda, but where I have a question is, aliba demand amar ein sochrin. According to the one who said, and Shmuel was the one who argued and said that if the Nachri showed up on Shabbos, you cannot do that schirus and bittul. So the question is, maybe when Shmuel said, I disagreed with how Rabbi Yochanan, or when Shmuel's rules would say that he disagreed with how Rabbi Yochanan allowed both schirus and bittul, maybe tartihu de lo avdinon. Maybe it's only the reason that Shmuel would not allow it is because, Shmuel in his third rule, is because you require in that case both schirus and bittul. But but maybe if you only needed one, avdinon, we would in fact do bittul. So maybe Shmuel would agree with Rabbi Yochanan that if the Nachri died on Shabbos, so you no longer have an issue of schirus and only one of bittul, he will allow bittul. Odilma loshna, or maybe it makes no difference. So the question basically is, at this point, we're at a scenario where the two Jews who are living in this chutzner with the guy and the guy died, they don't aser on each other now because the guy's not there, and they theoretically were relevant to that they at least now, we'll see in a minute about before, at least now they're relevant to doing an Eruv. So the question is, at this very point, it's been created a scenario where they meet the two of Shmuel's rules. But the question is, at the beginning of Shabbos, they didn't have it. So what would be the halacha in that case? In other words, will we say that Shmuel allows just bittul, and when Shmuel disallowed the case of Rabbi Yochanan with the inn, that was only because it entailed both schirus and bittul. So to that, Rav Sheshes answered Rav Chisda, Ani omer mevatlin, v'hamnuna omer ein mevatlin. So Rav Sheshes says, you know what? I think according to Shmuel, you would be able to do bittul. Why should you be able to do bittul? Because the way we're going to understand is, so he says, because Rashi says, Ani omer mevatlin v'lo dam yelahi deleel. This is not similar to the case of the inn. The hacha, because here, iboy meger ve'eruvin me'esmo matzi avdi. Because in this case, as opposed to the other case of the inn where the guys showed up on Shabbos, so when Shabbos started, they weren't relevant to doing an Eruv with each other. But here, it's true that they did not make an Eruv with the guy, before Shabbos, and then he died, but they could have made an Eruv with him yesterday. So therefore, we're going to say that this is a case where they could have made an Eruv with him, even though they didn't, and they did Aser on each other. So according to Rav Sheshes, he would say that Shmuel would agree that now, but you didn't make an Eruv, and you didn't do bittul, and you didn't rent it. But now that renting is irrelevant because the guy has died, so says Rav Sheshes, I think Shmuel would allow you to do bittul, even though in the case of Rav Yochanan he didn't allow it, but in this case he would allow it. Rav Hamnuna says, sorry, at the end of the day, when Shabbos started, it is, while it's true that they asered on each other, they had not made an Eruv, and therefore, Rashi says, Kivan di boy Eruve me'esmol, I'm sorry, that if they would have wanted to make an Eruv yesterday with the guy, lo mati avdi below schiros, they couldn't do it without rental, aim bittul el b'makam Eruv. So he says, he would say, I say Shmuel's rules have to exist at the beginning of Shabbos. At the beginning of Shabbos, you have to be in a position to make an Eruv, and you have to be Aser on one another. Now, they did Aser on one another, but they weren't in a position to make an Eruv because they had not rented from the guy. So the fundamental difference between Rav Sheshes and Hamnuna was, does the potential to have rented from the guy satisfy Shmuel's condition that they have to be relevant to an Eruv, or do you have to have previously removed all impediments to making an Eruv, i.e., did you have to have done the schiros already? Rav Hamnuna would say, yes, you have to have done the schiros, and therefore Shmuel would disagree also in this case, whereas Rav Sheshes would say, I think Shmuel would agree in this case with Rav Yochanan and say that since schiros has gone away because the Nachri has died, therefore you can do bittul at this point. Okay. Says the Gemara, we are 7 lines up from the bottom sign with sign on Aleph. I'm Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Nachri sheyesh lo Pesach arba pasuach lebika afilu machnes emotzi gemalim mikronos kol yom kula derech mavoi ein osra al bnei mavoi. So what does this mean? So we've talked about the fact that a nachri, if he's in the mavoi or he's in the chatzir with the other people, and he obviously can't be part of their eruv, and it's not enough if he's in mevatos or shus, he has to rent his space. So that's true if the nachri's entrance in and out of his house is through the chatzar. So then you need to deal with him and you need to do the schirus. But what Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel is if you have a nachri that's separate and apart from the opening he has onto the chatzar or the mavui where they are, that he has a separate entrance out of his back door, as long as it's daled by daled tfachim, that opens to a bika. A bika we know is a field basically. So then even if he ends up even if he brings through the mavoi all day camels and wagons, he's using the mavoi all day, it doesn't matter because he doesn't aser on them. Because basically the fact that he has an option to go out the back door, the Chachamim are going to basically, the Gemara says, my taima bepischa demiyachid le ba'hi nicha le. So we're going to say because even though in some instance the guy might decide, I like my mavoi better and bring all his camels and wagons through, but Chazal say, generally speaking, if someone has their own entrance that opens into a bika where they have plenty of room, they're more likely to use the back entrance, and therefore we're going to treat them as if he's not fully resident in this chutzner, and therefore we're going to allow the members of that chutzner to make an eruv amongst themselves, and the fact that the guy could use his front door and go through the mavoi doesn't detract from their ability to make the eruv. Ask the Gemara, Ibaylahu, okay, you just told me that if he has this little back door that opens onto a bika, onto a field where he has tons of space, that we're going to say that he no longer asers on the bnei chatzar. What happens if instead of opening to a bika, which is a field, but rather it opens to a karfeif? Says the Gemara, Pesuach lekarfeif mahu. So a karfeif, as we know, is an area that, generally speaking, the reference is to an area that's fenced in, that has mechitzas of some sort, but it is not used for residential purposes. So we say as follows, and we know that you can carry in a karfeif if it's less than beis asayim, which is basically 5,000 square amos, because 50 by 50 is a sa, and beis asayim is 2. So it's so in any event, So in that case, you can carry. If it's greater than that, you can't carry. So the question here is that if the guy's little back door opens to a karfeif instead of a bika, so it's a little more constrained, what's the halacha? Rav Nachman bar Ami mishmei the Ufana. Rav Nachman bar Ami said, in the name Ufana, Rashi says, seems to be the tradition. Sheshama me Rabbo, v'Rabba me Rabbo, that he heard from his Rebbe in turn heard from his Rebbe. So basically, Rav Nachman bar Ami says, I've heard the tradition, afilu pasuach la-karfeif. Even if it opens, we're on Amud Beis, now Samosai Amud Beis, even if the guy's little backdoor entry opens on the karfeif, that's sufficient to remove him from the chutzner because he's more likely to use his back door than his front door, and therefore he doesn't aser on the rest of the people. Rabba Rav Yosef Darmi Tavayu. Rabba and Rav Yosef clarified this and said, when is it okay that if he opens to a karfeif that we say he no longer asers on the bnei chutzner? He says as follows: Nachri beis asayim oser. Yoser mi beis asayim eno oser. They said, wait a second. When he opens to a karfeif, it depends how big the karfeif is. Because again, the rationale for saying, as the Gemara explained to us, why he may not aser on the bnei chutzner is because he prefers the more open space of a field and even the more open space of a karfeif. So says Rabban and Rav Yosef, so therefore, when is it true that even he prefers the karfeif over the mavoi? That's only when it's greater than 2 sa. But if it would be 2 sa or less, so 5,000 square amos or less, in that case, that's not enough space, and the guy would rather use the front door, and therefore his primary access is going to be through the chutzner, and therefore he's going to aser on the other people in the chutzner. So Rabban and Rav Yosef say, when do we say that if it's pasuach la-karfeif with his back door? That's only if it's a karfeif that's greater than 2 sa. Now, interestingly, for Yisrael, what happens now? We're going to deal with the following case. What happens if you have a Jew, you have 10 people in the chutzner, and 9 of them made an eruv, and 1 guy forgot? So, as we've said before, if he's not mevatos reshus, he asers on all of them. But if that Yisrael has a back door, so that leads out, so then same deal. We're going to say if he's more likely to use his back door, and therefore it's not going to aser. So say Rabban and Rav Yosef, but if Yisrael opens to a karfeif, beis asayim eno oser, it's the exact opposite of a guy. If it's 2 sa or less, it's not going to aser on the rest of the bnei chutzner. Yoser me beis asayim oser. But if it's more than beis asayim, it's going to be aser. Now, why is that? Because this goes back to what I said before. We know the halacha is that even though a karfeif is fully enclosed, so midoraisa it is a reshus yachid gamor, but nonetheless, the Chazal said if it's greater than 2 sa, you're not allowed to carry even any more than daled amos in it. So therefore, the whole rationale of saying that he doesn't aser on the bnei chutzner anymore is because he's more likely to use his back door than his front door. So when is he likely to use his back door? Only if he can carry out there. If he can't carry out there, he's not interested in the karfeif and he's going to go through the front door. So in what instance can a Jew carry in a karfeif? If it's less than 2 sa. So therefore, if it's less than 2 sa, he's likely to use the karfeif entrance, and therefore he doesn't aser on the rest of the bnei mavoi. But if it's greater than 2 sa, he can't even carry there. So what good is that entrance to him? So therefore, he's going to use his front door. Once he's going to use his front door, so then we're going to say that is a so now you have one member of a chutzner who hasn't joined in the eruv, and he's going to aser on the rest of the people unless he does bit or rishus. Okay, says the Gemara, Rava bar Chilkia bar Chakloi me Rav Huna. So this is actually the same question the Gemara asked before. Rava bar Chakloi asked Rav Huna, Pasuach lekarfeif mahu. This is going back to the case of a guy. What happens if a guy opens to a karfeif? Amrlei, Hari Amru. They said, beis asayim, if it's 2 sa or less, oser. Then he still asers on the rest of the bnei chutzner because he's more likely to use his front door if it doesn't have expansive space of greater than 2 sa. But yoser me beis asayim, if it's more than 2 sa, eno oser, the guy no longer asers on the rest of the bnei chutzner because he would rather use, even though it opens to a karfeif rather than a bika, as long as it's greater than 2 sa, he'd rather use his back door than his front door, and therefore he no longer asers on the bnei chutzner. Okay, says the Gemara, Amar Ula, Amar Rav Yochanan. So now we're gonna get into topics about the karfeif itself. So as I said before, a karfeif is an enclosed area. Midaraisa, an enclosed area is a reshus yachid. Doesn't matter how big it is. If it has mechitzas, it doesn't matter how big it is. It has to be at least daled al daled. Once it gets past there, so it's a makom chashuv that's daled al daled, and it has walls or some other kind of mechitza. So then that is a reshus yachid deraisa. However, Chazal said that if we have a karfeif that's greater than 2 sa, if we have a karfeif that's greater than 2 sa, that midirabanan, they're going to say that he cannot carry greater than 4 amos in it. We've dealt with that issue before. We talked about the fact that if it's for residential use, it's okay, but for any non-residential use that's greater than 2 sa, he can no longer carry. So now, it says, Ula Amrav Yochanan, karfeif yosem beis asayim, that if you have a karfeif that's greater than 2 sa, so more than 5,000 square amos, shelo hukaf ladira, that has not, that it's an enclosed area, and that enclosed area was not specifically for residential purposes. Vafilu kur, vafilu kurayim, even if it's a kur which is 30 sa, or kurayim which is 60 sa, 60 sa would be 150,000 square meters, so a huge area. Says Rabbi Yochanan, even if you have this massive area, as long as it's enclosed in walls, hazorik letocho chayav. If someone were to throw from a Rishus HaRabim into this karfeif, he's going to be chayav. So even if you have this massive karfeif and it's all enclosed, it's a pretty big area, nonetheless, if you throw from Rishus HaRabim into it, you're going to be chayav. Why? My time of mechitza because midoraisa has mechitzas, and as we said before, midoraisa, if something has mechitzas, it's a Rishus HaYachid, and therefore, obviously, if someone throws from Rishus HaRabim into Rishus HaYachid, he's going to be chayav. But so what's the reason we say that he can? So what's the reason we would have a havamina? Is because since we say you can't carry in it, maybe it's no longer Rishus HaYachid, because Rishus HaYachid, we know you can carry as much as you want in it in a given Rishus HaYachid. So the Gemara is going to say, no, the reason you can't carry is not because it's missing its status as a Rishus HaYachid, but rather El Shemekuseres Diorin, because it's missing residence. And Chazal said that if you have greater than 2 sa, where you do not have residence, so then we're going to say midrabanan you can't carry in it. So basically, Rabbi Yochanan's halacha, which with our understanding of karfeif is not very surprising, is the idea that a karfeif, while it's true that Chazal might say greater than 2 sa, we're not going to let you carry in it, but midaraisa, it's a regular Rishus HaYachid, and therefore you should be chayiv if you throw into it. So Masad Rav Huna Bar Chinana asked as follows. We say, we have a brayso, Sela shebayam gavoy asar v'roichav arba, ein metaltalin lo min limtocho liyam lo min hayam letocho. So you have a rock that is in the sea, so it's a little island that is 10 tfachim tall. So we know that walls, if they come out of the ground 10 tfachim, they go up. So therefore you have this rock coming out of the water, going up 10 tfachim, so it has mechitzas. And it's 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim. So basically, it's Rishus HaYachid. So we're saying you cannot carry from this rock into the sea, not from the sea onto the rock. Why? Because the sea, we know, is a classic case of a karmelis, and Chazal or Misakin that you can't carry from a karmelis to Rishus HaYachid or vice versa. So again, we're not saying anything that's terribly surprising. Pachos mikan. But if it's less than, so the ratio is saying that if you have a rock that's a Rishus HaYachid, you can't carry in or out of the sea. But pachos mikan, if the rock is not 10 tfachim tall, let's say it's 6 tfachim tall, then metaltalin, then you could carry. Why? Because this is just 2 karmelises. And so as long as you're not going, as Rashi says, as long as you're not going further than 4 amos, you're allowed to carry from one karfeif to another. There's no problem with that. Your only limitation is you can't carry more than 4 amos at a time. So therefore, if the rock doesn't qualify as an independent Rishus HaYachid, it's just another karmelis in the middle of the sea, and therefore you could carry between the two of them. Now says the Brisa, something which the Gemara is going to try to figure out what it's talking about. The Gemara says, the Brisa says ad kama. How big can it be? We say ad beis asayim, until beis asayim. So now, what is that talking about when it says, how big can it be until beis asayim? Ahai, on what? Ilema seifa, if you're saying that it's going on the seifa, so the suggestion would be, the seifa said, if the walls aren't 10 tvachim, that then you could carry between the others. So the Gemara says, so it doesn't make sense that this thing ad kama, until what? That halacha, the halacha that says that it's just another karmelis, if it's greater than beis asayim, it's not. Says the Gemara, beis asayim tfei lo, is there such a halacha that a karmelis is only a karmelis up to 2 sa, and more than that not? V'hami karmelis, the karmelis come and taltal. All he's doing is he's carrying, if you're talking about a rock that's less than 10 tvachim tall, he's just carrying from one karmelis to another. Thank you very much. And he's just carrying from one karmelis to another, and there's no there's no reason to restrict them. So therefore, it doesn't make sense that this size limitation was going on the seifa. Elalav aresha, so it must have been going on the resha. So what did the resha say? V'hachi kamer. This is what it's saying. Sela shebayam gavasa v'rochav dalid. If you have a rock coming out of the sea that is 10 tefachim tall and 4 tefachim wide, 4 by 4. Ein metalton lo metocho liyam lo min hayam letocho. We're not going to carry. You cannot carry from it into the sea or the sea into it. Why? Because it's a rishus hayachid. Says the Gemara the way Rav Huna Bar Chinna is understanding. Ve'ad kama. So then the Bryce is coming to say, until how large do we say it's a rishus hayachid that you can't carry in or out of the sea? Ad beis hasayim. Until beis hasayim. Up to 2 sa, we're going to say it's a rishus hayachid, and you can't carry from it into the sea or vice versa. Ha yaser mi beis hasayim. But it seems to be saying that if it would be greater than 2 sa, if the rock is greater than 2 sa, all of a sudden metaltalin. So then you could carry. So why does that make sense? Alma, what do you see? Carmelis he, that it's a carmelis. Tiyufta to Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan was the one who said, as it doesn't matter how large the karfeif is, it's still, if you throw from Rishus Rabbim into it, you're over on the Issur D'Oraisa. So why? Because a karfeif is a Rishus Yachid. What Rav Huna Bar Chinna seems to be asking is, from this brisa that seems to be saying that a rock, which is a Rishus Yachid, once it gets over Beis Hasayim, it loses its status as a Rishus Yachid, even Minatorah, and that's why Chazal said that's why they said you could carry, once it's over 2 sa, you could carry from the sea to it and it to the sea, because it seems to lose its status as a Rishus Yachid. So this is a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan, who said that it doesn't matter how large the karfeif is, as long as it's surrounded by mechitzas, it's a Rishus Yachid gemura. I'm sorry, 1 second. Thank you, Moshe. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava. So Rava was not impressed with this question by Rav Huna Bar Chinna. He said, Mandalo yadi terutza masnaisa tiyufta mosav leil Rabbi Yochanan. Someone who doesn't know how to answer up Mishnayos is going to ask a tiyufta on Rabbi Yochanan. I guess he was a younger person, whatever he did. Rava didn't like that he was asking on Rabbi Yochanan from this brisa. He says, La'olam aresha. It is true that the question of until how much, and he said until Beis Hasayim, was going on the resha, but not the way you said. In other words, you, Rav Huna Bar Chinna, assumed that it was a limitation on the resha. The resha says that this rock coming out of the sea is a Rishus Yachid, and he seemed to think it means that once you reach 2 sa, the Rishus Yachid falls off. He says no, really v'hachi kamar. Rather, as Rashi explains, the size limitation at the end of the brisa was not going on the resha itself, but on the diuk of the resha, because you could be medayik in the resha to say the resha said that as long as you have this rock that's 10 tefachim tall and 4 by 4, you cannot carry from it to the sea or the sea to it. So that you can't transfer between it and the sea. But on the rock itself, metaltalin, you would be able to carry. So it's basically saying this is a Rishus Yachid, and therefore you could carry it in it. So to this, says the Brisa, Viad Kama, until when does the diuk in the Mishnah allow you to carry on this rock? Ad Beis Hasayim, until Beis Hasayim, because this rock in the middle of the sea is no different than a karfeif. Once you get greater than 2 sa, that is not for residential purposes. So you have just this rock in the sea. It's not for residential purposes. So therefore, the Brisa was saying, once you reach the size of 2 sa on this rock, now midrabanan they're not going to let you carry, just like a karfeif, which is also Rishus Yachid. But once you reach 2 sa, they don't let you carry more than daled amos. So therefore, Rava says you got mixed up because you thought the size limitation was going on the halacha of the Mishnah. It was only going on the diuk you could make from the Mishnah that seemed to say on the rock you can carry. To that the Brisa comes to say, wait a second, you could carry on the rock, but only as long as it's less than 2 sa. Greater than 2 sa is no different than a karf if you can't carry. Rav Ashi has a different teretz to this. He says, La'olam aresha, that really, I agree with you that the size limitation is going on the resha. Not only that, it's not going on it's not going on a diuk, it's going on the actual halacha. And it's basically saying that the limitation that's in the resha falls off when, and I'm going to explain this outside first, and then we'll read it inside. He's saying, I'm even willing to say that the resha, that the size limitation at the end of the brisa is telling you that the restriction of the resha falls off when it gets greater than 2 sa. So therefore, from when you have this rock coming out of the sea, you cannot carry from it into the water or the water onto it. Until when is that? Until Beis Hasayim. Once you get greater than Beis Hasayim, then you can carry between it and the sea. So now you might say, well, wait a second, so then that's a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. So to this, Rav Ashi is saying, no, it's not a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan, because I'll explain to you why we had this. And again, I'll explain this outside and then we'll read it. So the Gemara is going to say, as Rashi is going to say as follows, that there's two conflicting takanas of Chazal. One is the idea that if you have that you don't carry from a Carmelis to Rosh Hashanah. Why? Because we're worried that if you do that, a Carmelis in some instances appears like a Rosh Hashanah. If we allow you to transfer from a Carmelis to Rosh Hashanah, people will transfer from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah. So therefore, we don't let you transfer between a Carmelis and another kind of Roshos. That's one takana. The other takana is that if you have this great expanse, you have this greater than Beis Hasayim that's not for residential purposes, they say you can't carry greater than 4 amos, right? So we have these two rules, and basically what we're going to say is as follows: that when you have a scenario of this rock in the sea, we have a conflict between the two rules. Why? Because the rule that says you can't carry greater than 4 amos, we're a little bit worried about that rule, because we're a little worried about treating this as an entire Rishus HaYachid, treating this totally as a Rishus HaYachid, saying you can't carry from it to the sea or the sea to it, because if so, people might think that if you can't carry between it and the sea, people might think it's an actual Rishus HaYachid, and then they're going to come to carry more than Daled Amos, so they're going to be over on that takana of Chazal, right? So therefore, we're going to say we're going to relax the restriction. That's the Chazal is going to relax its restriction of carrying from the Carmelis. Carrying from Rosh Hashanah to a Carmelis, from this rock, which is a Rosh Hashanah, to the sea. We're going to relax that restriction. So let's just read it inside. So Rav Ashi says, Li'olam HaReisha, you're right, it's going on the Reisha, and it's going on the core halacha of the Reisha. Hein Amru v'Hein Amru. They said two things, and those two things produced a conflict. Hein Amru, they said, Karfeif Yasim Beis Hasayim Shalahukif Ladira, that if you have a Karfeif that's greater than 2 saw, that is not constrained for residential purposes, Ein Metaltal and Bo Ela B'Daled Amos. You can only carry it with the Daled Amos. So therefore, they're basically saying that we're imposing on this rock, the idea that you should not carry more than Daled Amos, because we don't want people to come to carry more than Daled Amos and Rosh Hashanah. The Hein Amr, they also said, Ein Metaltam Rosh Hashanah Lekarmelis. They also said that you cannot carry from Rosh Hashanah to a Carmelis. Why? Because they didn't want you to mix it up with Rosh Hashanah. So now we're going to say as follows: Beis Hasayim Deshari L'Taltule Bekulo Asri Rabbanan L'Taltule Lo Menayam L'Tochav Lo Metochel Yam. So he's going to say as follows: if you have a rock that's less than 2 saw, so it's a full Rosh Hashanah, and the gezerah of Karfeif greater than 2 saw doesn't start because it's less than 2 saw. So therefore, it's a full Rosh Hashanah. He could carry in the entire thing. So therefore, Rabbanan are going to say we're going to treat it just like a regular Rosh Hashanah. That therefore the Rabbanan are going to say you can't carry from it to the sea or the sea to it. Why? My timer Rosh Hashanah Gemurahi, because it's a full Rosh Hashanah, and just like any Rosh Hashanah, we're not going to let you carry into the sea or from the sea into it, because that's transferring between a Rosh Hashanah and a Carmelis. So if you're talking about a rock that's less than 2 saw, Chazal could put in their takana and say no carrying between it and a Carmelis, and there's no problem. But Yaser Mebeis Hasayim, when it's greater than 2 saw, the Asur L'Taltule B'Kulei, that you're not allowed to carry in the whole thing. Why? Because Chazal said if it's greater than 2 saw in a karfeif, we're not going to let you carry more than Daled Amos. So now Chazal were worried. Well, wait a second. If we do that, if we say that you cannot carry more than Daled Amos in it, so then in that case Sharu Rabbanon. So Sharu Rabbanon L'Taltule Mitochel Yam Umiyam L'Tocho. That because Chazal did not want to create a problem, which we're going to explain in a second, so therefore they said, you know what? Because we want to impose our restriction of not going greater than 4 amos, so therefore we're going to loosen our restriction on carrying from Rosh Hashanah to a Carmelis, meaning to the sea. My taima Dilma Amre Rosh Hashanah Gemurihi, because if we tell you, here's the issue, if we tell you that you cannot carry from this rock that's greater than 2 sa into the sea, or from the sea into it, then they might think it's a Reshus HaYachid Gemura, v'asi l'taltule b'kula, and they're going to come to carry in all of it. So basically, the concern here is as follows. If I tell you you can't carry between this rock and the Carmelis, which is the sea, you might think it's a Reshus HaYachid Gemura, and therefore you're going to come to carry Daled Amos, you're going to come to carry on the whole thing and not limit yourself to Daled Amos. So because of that concern, Chazal said, you know what, I'm not going to allow, we're going to allow you to transfer between it and the sea, which is obviously is not a problem with the Raisa, because the whole institution of not transferring from Reshus HaYachid to a Carmelis is the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan say we're going to do away with our restriction on carrying from Reshus HaYachid to a Carmelis in this case, and you can carry when it's greater than Beis Sasayim, you could carry between the rock and the sea. Why? Because we wanted to maintain the restriction on anyone going more than 4 amas. And if we treat it that you cannot carry between it and a Carmelis, people might think it's a Reshus HaYachid Gemura and they're going to travel the whole thing. So the Gemara is now going to ask, Umay Shna. So wait a second. You have conflicting ideas here. On the one hand, you have a takana, you don't want to carry from Reshus HaYachid to a Carmelis because we're worried you're going to come to carry from Reshus HaYachid to Reshus HaRabim. So why are you relaxing that restriction in favor of the restriction to make sure that you don't walk 4 amas? Why not say that we're going to release the restriction that you don't walk 4 amas so that people don't come by accident to transfer from this to transfer to Reshus HaRabim? So basically the idea is Chazal are protecting, according to Rashi, one of their takanas more than the other. They're protecting the limitation of 4 amos by saying we're going to show you that it's not a Reshus HaYachid Gemura because we're going to allow you to transfer between it and a I'm sorry. We're going to allow you to. We're not going to allow. We're going to allow you to transfer between it and the sea. We're going to release our restriction on that, so that you shouldn't come to think that it's a Reshus HaYachid Gemura where we wouldn't let you transfer between it and the sea. So, Ma'ishna, why do you care more about one than the other? Tocho shchiach. For someone to carry in a large rock, that's a common. That's a common scenario, that someone is on this rock in the middle of the sea. He's going to want to carry more than Daled Amos, and we don't want him to because it's more than 2 sa. So that rule we're going to keep in place. But the idea that when this guy's in the middle of the sea and he's on this big rock, that he's going to transfer between the rock and the sea, or between the sea and the rock, that's not so likely. It's not likely to happen because what's he doing? What's he transferring things into the sea? So therefore, Chazal say in this, Rav Ashi answers, the Brisa has nothing to do with Rabbi Yochanan. Everyone agrees that this is a Reshus HaYachid Gemura Midaraisa. The question is as follows. Chazal said, when you have a guy out in the middle of the sea on this big rock on Shabbos, we don't want him to think it's a Reshus HaYachid Gemura where he can walk the whole thing. So we're going to allow him to do between the sea and the rock. And the reason we're doing that is because it's by relaxing that restriction, it's going to come into play only a little bit because he's not that likely to transfer things between the sea and the rock. But we're going to keep in place our restriction on going more than 4 amos, which is the restriction that Chazal apply in a case of a karfef, but also in the case of this rock, which they're both a karfef in this rock, or Reshus HaYachid Gemura min HaTorah because they have mechitzos, but we're going to restrict you from carrying more than Daled Amos because we don't want people to carry in an area greater than Beis Hasayim more than Daled Amos because they might come to carry like that in a Reshus